On January 14, 1814, in the northern German city of Kiel, two diplomats signed a document that transferred the Kingdom of Norway from one crown to another. The Norwegians were not consulted. They were not present. A country of nearly 900,000 people had been traded like a debt settlement between European powers, the same way territories had been exchanged for centuries, as though geography and the people attached to it were simply items on a ledger. What happened next was not supposed to happen. Within weeks, Norway had a prince rallying its population to resist. Within months, 112 elected delegates had gathered in a manor house north of the capital and written one of the most liberal constitutions in the world. And by May 17, 1814, while Napoleon's empire was dissolving in fire and exile, Norway declared itself an independent nation. The story of how a small northern country, long considered a province of Denmark, seized the chaos of the Napoleonic era to rewrite its own future begins centuries before that winter day in Kiel. Norway had been inhabited since at least 10,000 years before the Common Era, when the retreating glaciers of the last ice age opened a coastline warmed by the Gulf Stream, and the first hunter-gatherer communities moved north along the water's edge. By the 8th century, the coastal districts of what would become Norway were home to dozens of petty kingdoms, small territories controlled by chieftains who taxed, fought, and traded along the sea routes from the Fjord to the northern coasts of Trondheim and beyond. The Viking Age pulled those chieftains onto the world stage. Between roughly 790 and 1050, Norse seafarers from Norway raided, traded, and settled across a territory that stretched from the coast of Newfoundland in the west to the rivers of Russia in the east. They founded Dublin in 841. They colonized Iceland beginning in 874. Leif Erikson, sailing from Greenland around the year 1000, established a settlement at what is now L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, the first confirmed European presence in the Americas, 5 centuries before Columbus. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Thank you for your support, and now, let's continue. The unification of those petty Norwegian kingdoms began around 872, when Harald Fairhair won the Battle of Hafrsfjord, a sea battle near present-day Stavanger, and began the long process of consolidating the country under a single throne. It took generations to fully realize. The North resisted. The powerful Jarls of Lade in Trondheim submitted in name, but not always in practice. But the process was irreversible, and by the early 11th century, Norway was a recognizable kingdom with a Christian church, a developing legal code, and kings who corresponded with the courts of England and Germany. The high point of Norwegian independence came under Håkon IV, who ruled from 1217 to 1263. Under Håkon, Norway governed a North Atlantic empire that included Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides. The royal court at Bergen was the center of this empire. Bergen was at the time the largest city in Scandinavia, its harbour ringed with church spires, its wharves busy with merchants from Germany, England, and the Baltic. Norway had a population of roughly 300,000 and commanded territories across 3 oceans. Then, in 1349, a ship arrived in Bergen from England, carrying the Black Death. Within a year, between 40 and 60% of Norway's population was dead. Entire villages were abandoned. Farms stood empty for decades. The Norwegian aristocracy, thin to begin with in a country where feudal landholding never developed as deeply as in continental Europe, was effectively destroyed. The church, which had accumulated wealth and thus could sustain losses better than families dependent on agricultural labor, emerged from the plague as the dominant institutional power in the country. The Norwegian royal male line died out in 1319, and the throne passed by dynastic succession to Sweden, then to a joint Scandinavian monarchy, and finally, in 1380, to Denmark, when the Norwegian and Danish crowns were united under a single king. In 1397, Norway was folded into the Kalmar Union, a 3-kingdom confederation of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under Danish leadership. Sweden broke away from the Kalmar Union in 1523, Norway did not. The country was too weakened by plague and too dependent on Danish administrative support to mount a credible resistance. In 1537, the Danish king Christian III declared the Reformation and simultaneously proclaimed Norway a Danish province. All church lands were confiscated. The Norwegian Council of State, the last institutional body with any claim to Norwegian sovereignty, was dissolved. For the next 277 years, Norway was governed from Copenhagen. Danish became the written language of administration, law, and literature. Norwegian dialects survived in everyday speech, but a Norwegian wanting to write a letter to a government official, draft a legal document, or read a published book did so in Danish. The distinct Norwegian cultural identity survived in folk songs, folk tales, and the stubborn particularities of regional dialects. But it had no official institutional expression. The country's economy during this period was not uniformly grim. The water-powered sawmill, introduced to Norway's fjord valleys in the early 16th century, transformed the timber trade. Norway had enormous forests, and the new mills allowed logs to be processed into boards at a scale impossible with hand tools. In 1544, a deal with the Netherlands opened Dutch markets to Norwegian timber. The city of Amsterdam was built on piles of Norwegian wood. Timber merchants in the eastern valleys and around the Oslofjord became wealthy enough to build manor houses, educate their sons in Copenhagen, and accumulate the kind of capital that, a century later, would translate into political ambition. Mining added another economic dimension. Silver mines at Kongsberg, discovered in 1623, and copper mines at Røros produced revenues that flowed primarily to the Danish crown, but also enriched the local operators and merchants who managed the work. Norwegian shipping expanded through the 17th and 18th centuries, with the merchant fleet carrying goods across the North Sea and into the Baltic on behalf of a country that lacked the political independence to direct its own trade policy. What did not develop during this long Danish period was a Norwegian administrative class. The key positions in Norway, the governors, the high judges, the senior clergy, were consistently filled by Danes. Norwegians might accumulate wealth through timber and fish, but the instruments of government remained Danish. That arrangement held stable until 1807. In that year, Britain's Royal Navy bombarded Copenhagen in a preemptive strike. The British feared that Napoleon might seize the powerful Danish fleet and use it against them. The bombardment killed nearly 2,000 civilians and destroyed large portions of the city. The Danish king Frederick VI, infuriated, allied Denmark-Norway with Napoleon. For Norway, Napoleon's alliance meant a British naval blockade that cut off food imports. Grain shipments from Denmark stopped. Famine spread through Norwegian communities that had become dependent on imported cereals. Between 1807 and 1814, Norway lost a measurable fraction of its population to starvation and related illness. The suffering created a specific Norwegian grievance against the Danish connection, not an abstract political resentment, but a visceral hunger that sharpened the case for separation. When Napoleon's coalition collapsed at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, Denmark's position became immediately untenable. Sweden, which had joined the Allied coalition under its new Crown Prince Karl Johan, a French marshal named Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, who had been elected heir to the Swedish throne in 1810, demanded Norway as compensation for territories it had lost to Russia. The Allied powers agreed. On January 14, 1814, Frederick VI signed the Treaty of Kiel and ceded Norway to the King of Sweden. He retained Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, Norwegian overseas dependencies that Sweden's negotiators apparently considered of marginal value. The man who refused to accept this was Christian Frederick, the Danish Crown Prince and Norway's royal viceroy. 31 years old, ambitious, and genuinely moved by Norwegian nationalist sentiment, he declared that the Danish king had no right to transfer Norwegian sovereignty without the consent of the Norwegian people. On February 16, 1814, he convened a meeting of prominent Norwegians at Eidsvoll, an ironworks manor north of Christiania, owned by his friend Carsten Anker. The assembled men argued that Norwegian sovereignty had reverted to the people themselves. Elections were organized across the country. On April 10th, 112 delegates, clergy, military officers, civil servants, timber merchants, and farmers, arrived at Eidsvoll to write a constitution. They did it in 5 weeks. The Norwegian constitution, adopted on May 16th and signed on May 17th, 1814, was inspired by the American Declaration of Independence of 1776 and the French revolutionary constitutions of the 1790s. It established popular sovereignty, divided power between the executive, a national parliament called the Storting, and an independent judiciary, and declared Norway a free and indivisible realm. It was, at the time, one of the most liberal national constitutions in the world. Christian Frederick was elected king the following day. Sweden did not accept this. Karl Johan marched into Norway on July 29th with a well-equipped army. The Norwegian forces were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought. Norwegian troops held Swedish forces at Kongsvinger and won a tactical engagement at Langnes. The resistance was not symbolic. It was real enough to force Sweden into a negotiated settlement rather than a military conquest. The Convention of Moss, signed in August, ended the hostilities. Norway accepted a personal union with the Swedish king. But Karl Johan, who wanted a stable northern flank and not a resentful occupied country, accepted the Norwegian constitution almost intact. Christian Frederick abdicated and returned to Denmark. On November 4th, 1814, the Storting adopted a modified constitution, and Norway entered the union with Sweden as a constitutional monarchy with its own parliament, its own laws, and its own government in Christiania. It was not full independence. The king and foreign policy were shared with Sweden, but Norway had a constitution, a parliament, and legal institutions that were entirely its own, something it had not possessed since the 13th century. The union with Sweden lasted until 1905, when Norway dissolved it by referendum and declared full independence. The Swedish government accepted the result. There was no war. The constitution, signed at Eidsvoll on May 17, 1814, still governs Norway today. It is the second oldest functioning national constitution in the world, after the Constitution of the United States. Every year, on May 17th, Norwegians march in parades, wave flags, and celebrate the day that 112 men in a manor house, in the middle of a continent-wide war, decided that their country belonged to itself. The 45 years between 1814 and the 1850s were a period of nation-building unlike anything Norway had attempted since the medieval period. The Storting, meeting in Christiania, passed legislation that steadily expanded Norwegian self-governance within the Union framework. A national bank was founded in 1816. A customs administration was established. Norwegian civil servants, educated in Norwegian institutions and promoted through Norwegian channels, began replacing the Danish-trained officials who had dominated the country's bureaucracy for generations. The Norwegian language itself became a political issue. Or rather, the absence of a genuinely Norwegian written language became a political issue, because the written Danish that Norwegians used for official purposes was increasingly felt as a mark of colonial subordination. Two distinct solutions to this problem emerged in the 1830s and 1840s. The philologist Ivar Aasen spent years travelling through Norway's rural valleys, documenting the dialects that had survived the Danish period untouched by Copenhagen's influence. From this material, he constructed landsmål, later called nynorsk, New Norwegian, a written form based on the rural dialects of Western Norway that had the deepest roots in the medieval Norse language. Simultaneously, urban intellectuals were developing a reformed version of written Danish that incorporated Norwegian pronunciation and vocabulary, eventually standardized as bokmål. The tension between these two approaches to written Norwegian persists in the country's language politics to this day, with both forms recognized as official. The political struggle for full independence from the Swedish Union intensified through the second half of the 19th century. The central conflict was over the composition of Norway's government. The Swedish king insisted on appointing ministers from outside the Storting. Norwegian parliamentarians insisted that government ministers be accountable to the parliament. In 1884, after decades of constitutional conflict, the principle of parliamentary government was established in Norway, the first Scandinavian country to achieve it. The king was forced to appoint a government that reflected the Storting's majority. Full independence came in 1905, triggered by a dispute over Norwegian consulates abroad. The Storting unilaterally declared the union with Sweden dissolved on June 7th. Sweden initially threatened military action. A Norwegian referendum held in August produced a result of 368,000 in favour of independence against a mere 184 against. Sweden accepted the outcome. Prince Carl of Denmark was elected King of Norway and took the name Håkon VII, deliberately chosen to connect the new monarchy to the line of medieval Norwegian kings that had ended in 1319. The country that emerged as fully independent in 1905 was not the country that had existed in 1814. It had a functioning parliament, an established civil service, a national literature, 2 written languages, and an economy that had transformed over the preceding decades from timber and fishing to shipping and industry. The merchant fleet had grown to be among the largest in the world. Emigrants had left for America in the hundreds of thousands, establishing Norwegian communities across the upper Midwest of the United States. The nation that 112 men had sketched in 5 weeks at Eidsvoll had taken 91 years to fully realize. But when it arrived complete.